You feel overwhelmed by workplace pressures that seem to multiply daily, and every setback shakes your confidence and disrupts your peace of mind. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your happiness outside of work, while each new challenge feels like it might be the one that finally breaks you. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history and bearing the weight of millions of lives during plagues, wars, and impossible decisions. The Stoic principles I'll share will give you a fortress of calm that no workplace pressure can penetrate. Using the same philosophy that sustained emperors through the darkest times, what worked to maintain peace of mind while governing millions can work for anyone facing modern stress and responsibility. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner strength has spread. When I was 27, I never imagined that a simple conversation with Emperor Antoninus Pius would change the trajectory of my entire existence. I was content being a philosopher, studying law, and living quietly with my thoughts and books. Then came the summons that would forever alter my understanding of what it means to bear responsibility. Marcus Antoninus said, his weathered hands clasping my shoulders, "I have chosen you as my successor." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had witnessed the purple cloak of imperial authority destroy men stronger than I, watched as the weight of absolute power crushed spirits and corrupted souls. Yet here I was, being handed the burden I had hoped to avoid. The moment I accepted, I felt the crushing weight settle upon my shoulders, not just the physical weight of the purple toga that marked my new station, but the psychological burden of knowing that every decision I made would affect millions of lives. Sleep became elusive. Every morning brought reports of wars, famines, political conspiracies, and administrative crises that demanded my immediate attention. I remember standing in my private chambers, staring at that purple cloak hanging on its golden hook, and realizing that all my philosophical training meant nothing if I couldn't find peace within myself while wearing it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Had spent years studying how to live a good life, only to discover that external achievements and positions of power meant absolutely nothing without inner tranquility. The empire's problems became my personal laboratory for Stoic practice. When barbarian tribes threatened our northern borders, I learned to separate my emotional response from the strategic necessity of action. When senators plotted against my policies, I practiced the discipline of not taking their opposition personally. When plague ravaged our cities, I discovered the profound difference between caring deeply about outcomes while remaining detached from my ability to control them. Leadership, I realized, is profoundly lonely. Surrounded by advisors, generals, and courtiers, I found myself more isolated than I had ever been as a simple philosopher. Everyone wanted something from me, needed something from me, expected something from me. The philosophical anchor I had developed in my studies became not just helpful, but essential for psychological survival. This is why I understand the modern executive who feels overwhelmed by competing demands, the manager drowning in responsibilities, the professional whose success has become a prison. The weight of leadership, whether you're leading an empire or leading a team, creates pressures that can either forge you into something stronger or crush you entirely. External achievements, titles, and recognition become meaningless burdens, unless you have developed the inner strength to carry them without losing yourself. The purple cloak taught me that true power comes not from what you can control externally, but from what you can master internally. Every leader, every professional climbing the ladder of success must learn this lesson. Your position will either reveal the strength of your character or expose its weaknesses. There is no middle ground. The first reports came from the eastern provinces in the 7th year of my reign. A mysterious illness was spreading through our legions, returning from campaigns in Mesopotamia. Within months, what we now call the Antonine Plague, had swept across the empire like wildfire, killing perhaps 5 million people, including some of my closest advisors and friends. I remember standing in my study, surrounded by scrolls from physicians across the empire, each offering different theories about the disease's cause and various remedies that proved useless. The most brilliant medical minds of our time were helpless against this invisible enemy. For the first time in my life as emperor, I was confronting a force that was completely beyond my control, beyond the reach of legions, beyond the influence of imperial decree. The plague stripped away every illusion I had about the extent of my power. I could command armies to march across continents, but I couldn't stop a disease from ravaging my people. I could build magnificent aqueducts and roads, but I couldn't prevent death from visiting the homes of both slaves and senators. This crisis became my greatest teacher in the fundamental Stoic principle that would sustain me through every subsequent challenge, the discipline of distinguishing between what is within our control and what is not. I spent countless nights walking the empty corridors of the palace, grappling with the weight of helplessness. My initial response was fury at the disease, at the gods, at my own powerlessness. But fury, I learned, was just another form of fighting against reality. The plague didn't care about my anger. Death didn't pause for my imperial commands. The only choice I had was how to respond to circumstances I couldn't change. This is when I developed what would become my core philosophical practice, focusing exclusively on my sphere of influence while accepting everything outside it. I couldn't cure the plague, but I could ensure grain supplies reached affected cities. I couldn't prevent death, but I could provide comfort to the grieving. I couldn't control the disease's spread, but I could control my own response to fear and uncertainty. The plague years taught me that external circumstances, no matter how devastating, only have the power to destroy us if we grant them that power. The disease took lives, but it couldn't touch the part of us that chooses how to respond. It could create chaos in the physical world, but it couldn't penetrate the fortress of a disciplined mind. I watched some people become consumed by fear, abandoning their responsibilities and retreating into denial. Others found courage they didn't know they possessed, stepping forward to help neighbors and strangers. The same external circumstance revealed dramatically different character traits in different people. The plague didn't change who people were, it revealed who they had always been. This lesson applies directly to modern crises that feel overwhelming and uncontrollable. Economic downturns, organizational changes, global pandemics, technological disruptions. These are the modern equivalents of the forces I faced as emperor. They test whether we've developed the philosophical strength to distinguish between our sphere of influence and external circumstances, between our response and the situations that trigger our responses. During my military campaigns along the Danube frontier, I spent countless hours studying the fortifications our engineers constructed to protect Roman settlements from barbarian raids. These weren't simple walls, they were sophisticated defensive systems with multiple layers of protection, strategic placement of watchtowers, and carefully designed choke points that could channel enemy forces into kill zones. Watching our military architects work, I had a profound realization. If we could build such impregnable physical fortresses, why couldn't we construct equally strong psychological defenses? This insight led me to develop what I came to think of as the inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that no external force could breach. The inner citadel isn't built in a day. Just as Rome's physical fortifications required years of careful planning and construction, it begins with recognizing that your mind is the only territory you truly govern. Armies can conquer cities, critics can attack your reputation, circumstances can strip away your possessions, but there remains one sanctuary that belongs exclusively to you, your capacity to choose your response to any situation. I learned to build the first wall of this citadel by practicing what I called the pause. Between any external stimulus and my reaction, I inserted a moment of conscious choice. When a senator criticized my policies in harsh terms, instead of responding immediately with anger or defensiveness, I would pause and ask myself, what response serves virtue? What response serves the common good? What response demonstrates the character I want to embody? The second wall was constructed through daily examination of my thoughts and judgments. I discovered that most of my suffering came not from external events themselves, but from my opinions about those events. A military setback was just a tactical situation requiring new strategy until I added the judgment that it was catastrophic or embarrassing. Rain during a campaign was simply weather until I decided it was unfortunate or poorly timed. The third wall involved developing immunity to both praise and criticism. I realized that seeking external validation was like leaving the gates of your citadel permanently open. When people praised my decisions, I learned to accept their words graciously while remaining internally unmoved. When they criticized me, I considered whether their feedback contained useful information, then discarded their emotional judgments. The highest wall, the one that took me years to complete, was accepting that everything external to my character was ultimately temporary and beyond my complete control. My health, my reputation, my wealth, even my life, all of these could be taken away without my permission. But my commitment to virtue, my capacity for reason, my choice of how to respond to circumstances, these formed the unconquerable core of my being. Inside this inner citadel, I discovered a profound peace that no external storm could disturb. Senate politics couldn't penetrate it. Military defeats couldn't breach it. Personal losses couldn't scale its walls. This wasn't indifference or emotional numbness. It was the deep calm that comes from knowing that your essential self remains intact regardless of external circumstances. The modern professional can build this same fortress. When your boss unfairly criticizes your work, the inner citadel asks, what response demonstrates my character? When colleagues receive promotions you deserved, it reminds you their success doesn't diminish my worth. When organizational changes threaten your position, it whispers, I control my response to this situation. Building your inner citadel requires daily practice, like physical exercise. Each time you choose your response rather than react automatically, you add another stone to your walls. Each time you separate external events from your judgments about them, you strengthen your defenses. Each time you act from principle rather than emotion, you make your fortress more impregnable. When I became emperor, one possessed something that most people spend their entire lives pursuing: unlimited power. I could have anything I wanted, go anywhere I desired, command anyone to do my bidding. Within the span of a single decree, I could acquire vast wealth, eliminate enemies, or indulge any pleasure imaginable. This absolute freedom taught me the most counterintuitive lesson of my philosophical journey. Getting everything you want is the surest path to misery. The problem with fulfilled desires isn't the getting, it's what happens afterward. I watched senators who had schemed for years to gain influence become restless and dissatisfied once they achieved their goals. I observed wealthy merchants who had amassed enormous fortunes continue to hunger for more with the same intensity that had driven them when they were poor. I saw generals who had won great victories immediately begin planning the next campaign, unable to find satisfaction in their accomplishments. This led me to understand the first of the three Stoic disciplines that would become the foundation of my philosophy, the discipline of desire. Most people approach desire backwards. They believe that getting what they want will make them happy. But I discovered that happiness comes from wanting what happens, not from making happen what you want. The discipline of desire requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to outcomes. Instead of measuring your success by whether you get what you want. You measure it by how gracefully you accept what you receive. This doesn't mean becoming passive or abandoning goals. It means holding your goals lightly, pursuing them with full effort, while remaining psychologically detached from the results. I've practiced this discipline daily through what I called the evening review. Each night, I would examine the day's events and my responses to them. When things went according to my plans, I reminded myself that this outcome was temporary and not guaranteed to continue. When things went differently than I hoped, I looked for the lessons and opportunities hidden within the apparent setbacks. The most challenging aspect of this discipline was learning to differentiate between preferences and needs. I could prefer that our military campaigns succeed quickly with minimal casualties, but I couldn't need them to unfold that way. I could prefer that senators support my policies enthusiastically, but I couldn't need their approval to maintain my inner peace. This distinction between preference and need became the key to psychological freedom. I discovered that most anxiety comes from confusing preferences with needs. When you need external circumstances to align with your desires in order to be content, you've made your peace of mind hostage to forces beyond your control. But when you can prefer certain outcomes while accepting whatever actually occurs, you maintain your equilibrium regardless of circumstances. The discipline of desire also taught me about the nature of enough. With unlimited resources at my disposal, I could have lived in unprecedented luxury. Instead, I chose simplicity, not from any moral superiority, but because I recognized that multiplying desires multiplies opportunities for disappointment. The person who needs little is rarely disappointed. The person who wants everything is never satisfied. In your modern professional life, this discipline manifests as the ability to pursue career goals passionately while holding them lightly. You can work diligently for a promotion without needing to get it to maintain your self-worth. You can prefer financial success without requiring it for contentment. You can desire recognition for your contributions while accepting that recognition may not come. The ultimate freedom comes from needing nothing external for your peace of mind. This doesn't make you less effective, it makes you more effective, because you're operating from a place of inner strength rather than desperate need. When you don't need the outcome, you can focus entirely on the process. When you're not attached to results, you can take appropriate risks without being paralyzed by potential failure. The discipline of desire transforms you from someone who is constantly at the mercy of circumstances into someone who remains steady regardless of what happens. This steadiness becomes your greatest professional asset and your deepest source of personal satisfaction. Every morning before dawn, while the palace remained silent and the weight of imperial duties had not yet descended upon my shoulders, I maintained a sacred ritual that became the foundation of my psychological strength. I would rise in the darkness, light a single oil lamp, and spend the first hour of each day in philosophical preparation for whatever challenges lay ahead. This wasn't prayer in the traditional sense, nor was it simply reviewing the day's schedule. It was a deliberate practice of mental conditioning, like a soldier checking his armor before battle or an athlete warming his muscles before competition. I understood that the mind, like the body, required daily preparation to perform at its highest level under pressure. My morning practice began with what I called negative visualization, deliberately imagining the worst possible scenarios I might face that day. I would envision senators openly challenging my authority, military defeats arriving by messenger, natural disasters striking our provinces, or personal losses that could shake my emotional equilibrium. This wasn't pessimism or morbid thinking, it was psychological preparation. By mentally rehearsing difficult situations before they occurred, I accomplished two crucial things. First, I removed the element of surprise that often intensifies our emotional reactions to setbacks. Second, I practiced responding with virtue and wisdom rather than with instinctive emotion. When challenges actually materialized during the day, I had already considered how to handle them with dignity and effectiveness. The second part of my morning routine involved reminding myself of life's fundamental impermanence. I would hold objects from my personal chambers, a favorite stylus, a piece of jewelry, even my imperial ring, and reflect on how these items would outlast my physical form. This practice of memento mori wasn't meant to create sadness, but to cultivate perspective and urgency about what truly mattered. Understanding that my time was limited helped me focus on essential rather than trivial concerns. Petty disputes between senators seemed less important when viewed against the backdrop of eternity. Personal slights lost their sting when I remembered that both I and those who delivered them would soon be dust. This perspective didn't make me indifferent to my responsibilities, made me more focused on fulfilling them with virtue and excellence. The final element of my morning practice involved asking myself 3 fundamental questions that would guide my actions throughout the day. What must I do today that serves the common good? How can I respond to challenges in a way that demonstrates virtue? And what would I do today if I knew it was my last day alive? These questions served as a philosophical compass, helping me navigate complex political situations and personal interactions with clarity and purpose. When faced with difficult decisions during the day, I would return to these morning reflections and ask how my choices aligned with the principles I had established in the quiet hours before dawn. The consistency of this practice proved more important than its specific content, like drops of water eventually carving through stone. Daily philosophical preparation gradually transformed my character and responses. Over time, I found that I needed less conscious effort to respond wisely to difficult situations. The principles had become so deeply ingrained that they operated automatically. Your modern life demands the same kind of daily preparation. Before checking emails or diving into meetings, spend time conditioning your mind for the challenges ahead. Visualize difficult conversations and practice responding with composure. Remind yourself of what truly matters beyond immediate pressures. Ask yourself how you want to show up in the world today. This morning practice becomes your secret weapon against stress and reactivity, giving you an inner stability that others will notice but may not understand. Of all the Stoic practices that transformed my understanding of life, none was more powerful than my daily contemplation of death. This might seem morbid to those who haven't experienced its liberating effects, but I discovered that accepting mortality became my greatest source of courage, clarity, and inner strength. The practice began during my early years as emperor, when I witnessed the sudden death of a close advisor during what should have been a routine Senate meeting. One moment he was arguing passionately about grain distribution policies, and the next he had collapsed, never to speak again. The shock of watching life disappear so quickly forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Death could claim me at any moment, regardless of my imperial status or careful planning. Rather than fleeing from this reality, I decided to embrace it as a teacher. Each morning, I would spend time reflecting on the fact that this day might be my last. This wasn't a depressing exercise, it was the most energizing practice I ever developed. When you truly accept that your time is limited and uncertain, every moment becomes precious. Trivial concerns dissolve, and essential priorities crystallize with startling clarity. I began keeping small bronze coins on my desk, the same coins placed on the eyes of the dead during Roman funeral rites. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by political pressures or personal frustrations, I would hold one of these coins and ask myself, will this matter when I'm dead? How would I handle this situation if I knew I only had a month to live? What response would I be proud of if this were my final act? These questions transformed my decision-making process. Arguments with senators that once consumed hours of mental energy suddenly seemed petty and unworthy of my limited time. Personal slights that might have triggered days of anger became insignificant when viewed against the backdrop of mortality. The fear of making mistakes diminished when I realized that avoiding action was often a greater mistake than taking imperfect action. Death awareness also eliminated most of my fears about failure and judgment. What did it matter if historians criticized my military strategies after I was gone? Why should I lose sleep over senators who might speak poorly of my policies? The opinions of others, both positive and negative, would be irrelevant once I had returned to the dust from which I came. This practice gave me the courage to make difficult decisions that I might have avoided out of fear or political calculation. When facing tough choices about military campaigns, economic policies, or legal reforms, I would ask, what would I do if I had no concern for how this affects my reputation? The answer often pointed toward the right course of action, even when it was unpopular or risky. Perhaps most importantly, contemplating death taught me to prioritize relationships and virtue over achievements and accumulation. I stopped postponing conversations with loved ones, stopped delaying acts of kindness, stopped waiting for perfect conditions to express my values. If this day might be my last, I wanted to spend it in ways that reflected my deepest convictions about how to live well. The modern professional who embraces this practice discovers remarkable freedom. Fear of career setbacks diminishes when you remember that your career is temporary anyway. Anxiety about others' opinions fades when you realize that both you and your critics will soon be forgotten. The courage to pursue meaningful work increases when you accept that safe choices and risky choices both lead to the same ultimate destination. This doesn't make you reckless or nihilistic. It makes you more intentional and authentic. When you're not desperately trying to avoid the inevitable, you can focus on making your limited time meaningful. When you're not pretending that your current circumstances are permanent, you can respond to them with appropriate perspective and wisdom. Death becomes not an enemy to fear, but a teacher that shows you how to live. The Germanic tribes had been pressing against our northern borders for months, and intelligence reports suggested they were preparing for a massive, coordinated assault across multiple frontiers. As emperor, I faced a decision that would affect thousands of lives: launch a preemptive strike or wait for them to make the first move. Either choice carried enormous risks and unpredictable consequences. This moment taught me the second fundamental Stoic discipline, the discipline of action. While the discipline of desire focuses on how we relate to outcomes, the discipline of action concerns how we make decisions and take action when outcomes are uncertain, which is to say, always. The natural human tendency when facing important decisions is to delay action until we have perfect information or guaranteed results. But leadership, whether of an empire or a small team, requires acting decisively based on incomplete information while accepting that we cannot control the consequences of our choices. This paradox paralyzed me early in my reign until I learned to separate the quality of my decision-making process from the outcomes. It developed what I called virtue-based decision-making. Instead of asking what choice will produce the best results, I learned to ask what choice reflects virtue, justice, courage, wisdom, and self-discipline, regardless of what happens next. This shift freed me from the impossible burden of predicting the future and allowed me to focus on what was actually within my control. The character I demonstrated through my choices when facing the Germanic threat. I applied this framework systematically. Justice demanded that I protect Roman citizens from harm while not initiating unnecessary violence. Courage required that I make a clear decision rather than hiding behind indecision. Wisdom called for gathering the best available information while accepting its limitations. Self-discipline meant choosing based on principle rather than fear or political convenience. I chose to launch carefully planned defensive operations that would establish strong positions before the barbarians could organize their assault. The military campaign proved successful, but that wasn't the point. Even if it had failed, the decision would have been correct, because it was made through virtue rather than fear or expedience. This approach transformed how I handled every aspect of leadership. When senators presented competing policy proposals, I stopped trying to predict which would produce better long-term outcomes and focused on which reflected better values. When personal conflicts arose with advisors, I chose responses that demonstrated the character I wanted to embody, rather than responses designed to achieve specific results. The discipline of action requires accepting a fundamental truth. We are responsible for our efforts, not our outcomes. You can make excellent decisions that produce disappointing results due to factors beyond your control. You can also make poor decisions that happen to work out well due to luck or circumstances you didn't anticipate. Judging yourself by outcomes, rather than by the virtue demonstrated in your decision-making process, creates anxiety and leads to paralysis or reckless choices. I learned to measure my actions by asking, did I gather appropriate information before deciding? Did I consider the impact on others? Did I choose based on virtue rather than fear or selfish interest? Did I act with appropriate courage rather than hiding behind delay? If I could answer these questions positively, I accepted whatever outcomes followed without regret. This discipline proves essential in modern professional environments where you constantly face decisions with uncertain consequences. Should you accept a risky new role or stay in your current position? How should you respond when colleagues treat you unfairly? When should you speak up about problems and when should you remain silent? The discipline of action teaches you to focus on making decisions through virtue rather than trying to engineer specific outcomes. You choose the new role if it aligns with your values and growth, regardless of whether it guarantees success. You respond to unfair treatment in ways that reflect your character, regardless of whether it changes others' behavior. You speak up about problems when justice and courage demand it, regardless of potential consequences. This approach eliminates the anxiety that comes from trying to control uncontrollable outcomes, while ensuring that your actions consistently reflect your deepest values. Over time, this virtue-based approach tends to produce better results than outcome-focused decision-making, but the results become secondary to the satisfaction of knowing you've acted with integrity and wisdom. Senator Cassius was everything I despised in Roman politics: petty, self-serving, and openly contemptuous of any policy that didn't advance his personal interests. During Senate sessions, he would interrupt important discussions with frivolous objections, spread rumors about my advisors, and consistently vote against measures that clearly benefited the empire simply because I had proposed them. For months, his behavior triggered in me exactly the kind of anger and frustration that I knew corroded leadership effectiveness. Then, one morning, during my philosophical preparation, I had a realization that transformed not only how I dealt with Cassius, but how I approached every difficult person I encountered for the rest of my life. His behavior revealed nothing about me and everything about him. His actions were products of his character, his fears, his understanding of the world. They had nothing to do with my worth as emperor or as a human being. This insight led me to develop what became one of my most valuable practices: separating people's actions from their fundamental worth as human beings, while simultaneously separating their actions from my emotional responses. Cassius could continue his obstructionist behavior, but I would no longer allow it to disturb my inner peace or cloud my judgment. I began studying difficult people the way a naturalist studies animals, with curiosity rather than judgment. What motivated their behavior? What fears or insecurities drove their actions? What needs were they trying to meet through their choices? This shift from emotional reaction to analytical observation removed most of the personal sting from their difficult behavior. Cassius, I realized, was desperately insecure about his political relevance. Having achieved his position through family connections rather than merit, he lived in constant fear of being exposed as incompetent. His attacks on my policies weren't really about governance. They were attempts to demonstrate his importance and mask his inadequacies. Understanding this motivation didn't excuse his behavior, but it eliminated my anger and helped me respond more strategically instead of engaging in public confrontations that fed his need for attention. I began having private conversations with him about policy details, asking for his advice on minor issues where his input could be useful without affecting major decisions. This approach satisfied his need to feel important while minimizing his disruptive impact on serious matters. The broader principle I discovered was this: difficult people are usually fighting battles that have nothing to do with you. The colleague who constantly criticizes your work may be insecure about their own performance. The boss who micromanages everything may be terrified of losing control. The client who makes unreasonable demands may be under pressure from their own supervisors. When you understand the deeper motivations behind difficult behavior, you can respond with strategy rather than emotion. I also learned to expect nothing from difficult people and therefore never be disappointed by them. If I expected Cassius to support good policies regardless of their source, I would be constantly frustrated. But if I expected him to oppose anything I proposed regardless of its merit, I could plan accordingly and not waste emotional energy on surprise or disappointment. This practice of expecting people to behave according to their character rather than according to my preferences became liberating. I stopped trying to change people who had no interest in changing and instead focused on working effectively within the reality of who they actually were, rather than who I wished they would become. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that difficult people often serve as unwitting teachers. Cassius taught me patience. Argumentative generals taught me how to communicate more clearly. Dishonest advisors taught me to verify information independently. Instead of seeing difficult people as obstacles, I began viewing them as opportunities to practice virtue under challenging conditions. In your modern workplace, this same approach transforms how you handle colleagues who seem determined to make your life difficult. The coworker who takes credit for your ideas, the manager who plays favorites, the client who constantly changes requirements. These people become less frustrating when you understand that their behavior reflects their character, not your worth. You learn to respond strategically rather than emotionally, to expect consistency from people based on their demonstrated patterns rather than your hopes, and to use difficult interactions as opportunities to practice patience, clear communication, and principled responses. Most importantly, you stop allowing other people's behavior to determine your emotional state or self-worth. Difficult people lose their power to disturb you when you understand that they're fighting their own battles, not attacking your character. Every decision I made as emperor was carved into stone tablets and posted throughout the empire for public scrutiny. Citizens in distant provinces could read my decrees and judge my wisdom. Historians recorded my choices for posterity. Political opponents analyzed my policies for weaknesses they could exploit. Never in human history has anyone lived under more constant, intense public examination than a Roman emperor. The weight of this scrutiny nearly destroyed me in my early years of rule. I found myself crafting policies not based on what was right or effective, but on how they would be perceived by different audiences. I delayed important decisions while trying to anticipate every possible criticism. I spent sleepless nights worrying about what people were saying about my leadership in taverns and Senate chambers across the empire. This obsession with public opinion was making me a worse leader and a miserable human being. That's when I realized I was committing a fundamental philosophical error. I was trying to control something that was completely beyond my control, other people's thoughts and judgments about me. The breakthrough came during a particularly harsh winter when I was forced to raise taxes to fund military campaigns against Germanic tribes. The decision was strategically necessary but politically unpopular. Citizens complained bitterly about the increased burden. Senators criticized the timing. Military advisors questioned whether the campaigns were worth the cost. Even close friends expressed doubts about my judgment. In that moment of universal criticism, I discovered something liberating. Their opinions, whether positive or negative, had absolutely no power to change who I was or the correctness of my decision. The tax increased was either justified by military necessity or it wasn't. Public opinion couldn't alter that reality. I was either governing with wisdom and virtue or I wasn't. Their approval couldn't make me virtuous, nor could their disapproval make me corrupt. This realization led me to develop what I called the discipline of assent, the practice of choosing which thoughts and judgments to accept into my mind. Just as a fortress guard decides who may enter the gates, I learned to decide which external opinions deserved my attention and which should be dismissed. I established clear criteria for evaluating feedback about my leadership. Criticism from people whose judgment I respected, who had relevant expertise, and who offered specific, actionable suggestions, received serious consideration. But general complaints from those with no responsibility for governance, personal attacks unrelated to policy substance, and opinions from people who had never faced similar challenges were mentally discarded without emotional investment. The practice required distinguishing between my responsibility to consider feedback and my responsibility to be affected by it. I had a duty to listen to citizens' concerns and senators' objections, but I had no obligation to let their opinions determine my self-worth or emotional state. I could gather information from their responses while remaining internally detached from their approval or disapproval. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that seeking external validation was incompatible with principled leadership. If my primary goal was maintaining popularity, I would inevitably make decisions based on what people wanted to hear rather than what situations actually required. If I needed others' approval to feel confident in my choices, I would become paralyzed whenever that approval was withheld. I developed a daily practice of reminding myself that other people's opinions were ultimately beyond my control and therefore irrelevant to my peace of mind. Citizens would judge my policies based on how those policies affected their personal interests, not on their objective merit. Historians would evaluate my reign based on their own political biases and incomplete information. Even friends and advisors would view my decisions through the lens of their own experiences and limitations. None of these people had access to all the information I possessed when making decisions. None of them bore the responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. None of them would answer to history for the outcomes. Why, then, should their opinions carry more weight in my mind than my own careful analysis and commitment to virtue? This shift from external validation to internal conviction transformed both my leadership effectiveness and my personal happiness. I stopped crafting policies to win approval and started making decisions based on justice, wisdom, and the common good. I stopped losing sleep over criticism and started evaluating my performance based on whether I had acted with virtue and integrity. In your modern professional environment, this same principle provides profound freedom. Your boss's opinion of your work, your colleagues' assessment of your ideas, your industry's recognition of your contributions, none of these external judgments can determine your actual worth or the quality of your character. They may provide useful feedback, but they cannot and should not control your self-esteem or decision-making process. When you stop needing external approval to feel confident in your choices, you become far more effective at making decisions that serve long-term goals rather than short-term popularity. When you stop fearing criticism You become willing to take appropriate risks and advocate for unpopular but necessary positions. The messenger arrived at dawn with news that would test every philosophical principle I had developed over years of Stoic practice. Lucius Verus, my adopted brother and co-emperor, had died suddenly while returning from military campaigns in the East. Not only was I losing my closest companion and trusted partner in ruling the empire, but I was also facing the political chaos that would inevitably follow his death. Grief hit me like a physical blow. Despite all my training in accepting impermanence, despite years of contemplating death as a natural part of life, I found myself overwhelmed by a profound sense of loss. The man who had shared the burden of empire with me, who understood the unique pressures of leadership, who had been my closest confidant for over a decade, he was gone, and I would never speak with him again. My initial impulse was to fight these feelings, to suppress the grief through philosophical reasoning and emotional discipline. After all, hadn't I spent years learning that attachment leads to suffering? Shouldn't a properly trained Stoic be immune to such emotional turmoil? But as I struggled with these expectations, I realized I was making a fundamental error about the nature of Stoic philosophy. Stoicism doesn't eliminate natural human emotions, it teaches us how to experience them without being controlled by them. Grief at the loss of someone we love is not a philosophical failure. It's evidence that we're capable of deep connection and care. The goal isn't to become emotionally numb, but to process difficult emotions without allowing them to destroy our capacity for wise action. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of losing Lucius while simultaneously maintaining my responsibilities. As emperor, I grieved privately in my chambers each morning, honoring our friendship and acknowledging the genuine pain of permanent separation. But I didn't allow grief to prevent me from making necessary decisions about succession planning, military command changes, and the hundreds of administrative details that required immediate attention. This experience taught me the crucial distinction between feeling emotions and being controlled by them. I could be profoundly sad about Lucius's death while remaining functionally effective as a leader. I could miss his counsel and companionship, while accepting that his death was part of the natural order that governs all human life. I could honor his memory through my continued commitment to the principles we had shared rather than through prolonged dysfunction. The weeks following his death became a masterclass in what I came to understand as constructive grief, mourning that honors loss without abandoning life. I established specific times each day for remembering Lucius and processing my emotions about his absence. But I also maintained strict boundaries around this grief, not allowing it to contaminate my judgment during policy discussions or my interactions with people who needed my full attention. I learned to separate the permanence of loss from the permanence of its emotional impact. Lucius would never return, and that reality would always carry some sadness. But the acute pain of fresh grief was temporary, like a physical wound that heals gradually if properly tended. Fighting against the natural healing process only prolonged the suffering. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that grief could become a teacher rather than just a burden. Losing Lucius reminded me of how precious and temporary all relationships are. It motivated me to express appreciation more openly to people who mattered to me, to resolve conflicts more quickly, and to invest more intentionally in the connections that remained. The experience also deepened my empathy for others facing loss. When citizens petitioned me about family members killed in military campaigns, when advisors struggled with personal tragedies, when anyone in my sphere dealt with grief, I could offer genuine understanding rather than theoretical sympathy. In your modern life, this approach to loss and disappointment provides a framework for processing setbacks without being destroyed by them. Career disappointments, relationship endings, financial losses, health challenges, these experiences naturally produce grief, and that grief deserves acknowledgement rather than suppression. The key is learning to grieve constructively, feeling the emotions fully while maintaining your capacity for effective action, honoring what was lost while remaining open to what remains, processing pain without allowing it to become a permanent identity. Grief becomes destructive only when we fight against it or when we allow it to prevent us from engaging with the life that continues after loss. Loss is inevitable, but being broken by loss is optional. When I first accepted the imperial purple, my understanding of leadership was fundamentally selfish. I saw my role as emperor primarily through the lens of what I could accomplish, what legacy I could build, what mark I could make on history. I measured success by the expansion of Roman territory, the magnificence of public works, projects bearing my name, and the respect I commanded from senators and foreign dignitaries. This approach to leadership was exhausting and ultimately unfulfilling. Despite achieving military victories and implementing successful policies, I felt increasingly disconnected from any sense of deeper purpose. The weight of responsibility felt like a burden imposed upon me rather than a privilege I had embraced. That's when I encountered a philosophical concept that would revolutionize my understanding of what it meant to lead. The idea that true leadership is fundamentally about service rather than achievement. The transformation began during a particularly difficult period when plague was ravaging the eastern provinces. Instead of viewing this crisis primarily as a threat to my reputation or a challenge to my competence, I began asking a different question. How can I serve the people who are suffering? This shift from self-focused to service-focused thinking changed everything about how I approached the crisis. Rather than delegating the response to governors and military commanders while remaining safely in Rome, I traveled to affected regions to coordinate relief efforts personally, instead of treating the plague as a problem to be solved quickly so I could return to normal imperial business. I recognized it as an opportunity to demonstrate the values I claimed to represent. The goal became not my own political survival or historical reputation, but the welfare of citizens who depended on imperial leadership during their darkest hour. This experience taught me that leadership effectiveness increases dramatically when leaders stop viewing their roles as platforms for personal advancement and start viewing them as opportunities for meaningful service. When your primary motivation shifts from what can I achieve to how can I contribute, several profound changes occur in both your decision-making process and your relationship with responsibility. First, service-oriented leadership eliminates the anxiety that comes from ego-driven ambition. When your goal is personal achievement, every setback threatens your identity and every criticism wounds your self-worth. But when your goal is contribution to something larger than yourself, setbacks become learning opportunities and criticism becomes useful feedback rather than personal attacks. Second, focusing on service clarifies decision-making in situations where multiple options seem equally valid. When facing complex policy choices, I learned to ask, which option best serves the common good rather than my personal interests? This question cut through political calculations and personal preferences to reveal the most ethical course of action. Third, service-oriented leadership inspires others in ways that achievement-oriented leadership cannot. People will follow leaders who are obviously motivated by personal gain, but they will sacrifice for leaders who are genuinely committed to serving something greater than themselves. When your team recognizes that you're using your position to contribute rather than to advance yourself, their commitment and loyalty increase exponentially. I discovered that the Roman concept of duty was actually a form of privilege when properly understood. The opportunity to use my position, resources, and influence to improve the lives of millions of people was not a burden but an extraordinary gift. Very few humans in history have been positioned to make such a significant contribution to human welfare Viewing leadership through this lens transformed obligation into gratitude. The philosophy of service also solved the problem of legacy anxiety. When you're focused on personal achievement, you constantly worry about how history will judge your accomplishments. But when you're focused on service, you become less concerned with recognition and more concerned with impact. The work becomes its own reward, regardless of whether future generations remember your name. In your modern professional context, this same transformation is available regardless of your position or industry. Whether you're managing a small team or leading a large organization, whether you're serving customers directly or supporting colleagues behind the scenes, you can choose to view your role as an opportunity for meaningful contribution rather than personal advancement. This doesn't mean abandoning career goals or becoming indifferent to professional success. It means reframing those goals as byproducts of excellent service rather than as primary objectives. When you focus on contributing value to others, recognition and advancement often follow naturally. When you focus primarily on recognition and advancement, both service and satisfaction suffer. The leader who asks, "How can I serve?" rather than "How can I succeed?" discovers that true success comes from the magnitude of your contribution, not the size of your title. I will never forget the morning when Senator Flavius publicly accused me of financial corruption during a Senate session. Knowing his allegations were completely false, but calculating that the mere suggestion would damage my credibility. As he spoke, I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest, the primal surge of anger that demanded immediate retaliation. My hands clenched involuntarily, and for a moment I fantasized about having him arrested on the spot, using my imperial power to silence his lies permanently. That pause between his accusation and my response became one of the most educational moments of my philosophical development. In that brief space, I caught myself on the verge of making the exact kind of impulsive decision that destroys leadership, effectiveness, and personal integrity. The anger felt justified after all. He was lying about me publicly, but I realized that justified anger could still lead to unjustified actions. This incident forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my character. Despite years of Stoic study, I was still allowing external events to trigger internal emotional storms that clouded my judgment and tempted me toward reactive behavior. I had mastered many aspects of philosophy, but emotional mastery, particularly anger management, my greatest challenge. I began studying anger as systematically as I had once studied military strategy. What triggered it? How did it affect my decision-making? What were the costs of indulging it versus the benefits of controlling it? What I discovered was that anger was almost always based on a fundamental misunderstanding about how the world works. Anger typically arises when reality conflicts with our expectations about how things should be. Flavius should not have lied about me. Senators should support good policies, regardless of their source. Military campaigns should proceed according to plan. Citizens should appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf. But the world doesn't operate according to our preferences. It operates according to natural laws and human nature. I developed what I called the pause practice, deliberately inserting a moment of conscious choice between any trigger and my response. When someone said something that made my blood pressure rise, instead of responding immediately, I would take a breath and ask myself, what response serves my values? What response serves the situation? What response will I be proud of tomorrow? This practice revealed that anger, while it feels urgent and justified, almost never leads to optimal responses. Angry reactions tend to escalate conflicts rather than resolve them, damage relationships rather than improve them, and create new problems rather than solve existing ones. The temporary satisfaction of expressing anger is vastly outweighed by its long-term costs. I learned to reframe anger-provoking situations as opportunities to practice virtue under pressure. When Flavius made his false accusations, instead of viewing this as an attack on my character, I chose to see it as a chance to demonstrate composure and integrity. My calm, factual response to his allegations impressed even my political opponents and ultimately damaged his credibility more effectively than any angry retaliation could have. The key breakthrough came when I realized that emotional mastery wasn't about suppressing emotions, it was about experiencing them without being controlled by them. I could feel anger at injustice while choosing not to act from anger. I could acknowledge frustration with incompetence while responding with patience and clear communication. I could experience disappointment with outcomes while maintaining optimism about future possibilities. This approach required developing what I called emotional transparency, the ability to observe my own emotional states with the same objectivity I might observe weather patterns. Just as I could notice that it was raining without becoming upset about the rain, I could notice that I was feeling angry without being compelled to act on that anger. I practiced this transparency through daily emotional inventory each evening. I would review moments when I had felt strong emotions and examine how I had responded. Did I pause before reacting? Did my responses align with my values? Did I escalate or de-escalate conflicts? This self-examination gradually increased my awareness of emotional patterns and improved my ability to choose responses rather than react automatically. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that emotional mastery actually increases rather than decreases your effectiveness in difficult situations. When you're not consumed by anger, you can think more clearly about strategy. When you're not defensive about criticism, you can extract useful information from it. When you're not reactive to provocations, you maintain control over the direction of conversations and conflicts. In your modern workplace, this same emotional mastery becomes a superpower. The colleague who tries to undermine you, the boss who takes credit for your work, the client who makes unreasonable demands, these situations will continue to occur regardless of your emotional responses to them. But your ability to respond with composure rather than reactivity determines whether these challenges strengthen or weaken your professional relationships and reputation. The person who has mastered their emotional responses becomes unshakable in the face of any external pressure because they've learned that no one can make them angry, frustrated, or anxious without their permission. One morning, a courier brought disturbing news from the northern frontier. Our forces had suffered a significant defeat, losing nearly 1,000 men in what should have been a routine skirmish with Germanic tribes. My immediate reaction was a cascade of catastrophic thoughts. This is a disaster. My military strategy is fundamentally flawed. The army has lost confidence in my leadership. Other tribes will see this as weakness and attack. The Senate will question my competence. This defeat could destabilize the entire northern border. Within minutes, I had transformed a single military setback into an empire-threatening crisis, all through the power of my own interpretations and assumptions. That's when I realized I was witnessing the third Stoic discipline in action, or rather, my failure to practice it effectively. The discipline of assent concerns our power to choose which thoughts and judgments we accept as true, and which we examine critically or reject entirely. The facts of the situation were straightforward. Roman forces had engaged enemy tribes and suffered casualties while withdrawing from an unfavorable position. Everything else, my interpretations of what this meant, my predictions about future consequences, my judgments about responsibility and implications, these were additions created by my own mind, not inherent features of the external event. I began experimenting with what I called thought examination, the practice of distinguishing between factual observations and the mental commentary we automatically add to those observations. When reports arrived from distant provinces, I would consciously separate the actual information from my immediate emotional and analytical responses to that information. This practice revealed how much unnecessary suffering I was creating through undisciplined thinking. The military defeat was unfortunate, but it wasn't inherently catastrophic. Judgment was something I was adding. The loss of soldiers was genuinely tragic, but it didn't automatically mean my overall strategy was flawed. That conclusion was an assumption I was making. The enemy's success in this engagement didn't necessarily indicate they would succeed in future encounters. That prediction was speculation rather than fact. I developed a simple but powerful technique for managing my mental responses to challenging situations. Whenever I noticed my mind racing toward worst-case scenarios or dramatic interpretations, I would ask myself 3 questions. What do I actually know to be true? What am I assuming or predicting? What interpretations am I adding that might not be accurate or helpful? This inquiry process didn't eliminate natural emotional responses to difficult news, but it prevented me from amplifying those responses through undisciplined thinking. I could feel appropriate concern about military setbacks without concluding that they represented comprehensive strategic failure. I could acknowledge genuine problems without catastrophizing them into existential threats. The discipline of assent also applied to positive events. When military campaigns succeeded or senators praised my policies, I learned to examine my tendency to interpret these outcomes as validation of my overall competence or indications that future success was guaranteed. Just as I questioned negative interpretations, I questioned positive ones that might lead to overconfidence or complacency. Perhaps the most valuable application of this discipline involved my responses to criticism and praise from others. When citizens complained about my policies, I could separate their factual concerns from their emotional reactions and personal attacks. When advisors praised my decisions, I could appreciate their support without accepting their judgments as objective measures of my performance. I realized that most psychological disturbance comes not from external events themselves, but from our automatic interpretations of those events. The same military defeat could be viewed as a strategic disaster, a temporary setback, a learning opportunity, or an inevitable cost of defending the empire. The event itself was neutral until my mind assigned it meaning. This understanding revolutionized my approach to leadership challenges. Instead of being at the mercy of whatever interpretation first occurred to me, I became conscious of my power to choose how I would frame and respond to any situation. This wasn't denial or positive thinking. It was the recognition that multiple interpretations of any event are usually possible, and some serve better than others. The practice required constant vigilance, because the mind's tendency to add interpretive commentary to factual observations is both automatic and persistent. Like a guard stationed at the gates of a fortress, I had to remain alert to what thoughts I was allowing entry into my consciousness, and which ones deserved rejection or further examination in your modern professional environment. This discipline provides protection against a mental spiral that can transform manageable challenges into overwhelming crises. The email from your boss requesting a meeting, the project deadline that gets moved up, the colleague who seems to be avoiding you. These situations are factually neutral until your mind assigns them meaning. You can choose to interpret changed deadlines as evidence that management doesn't trust your time management, or as opportunities to demonstrate flexibility under pressure. You can view a boss's meeting request as a sign of impending criticism, or as a normal part of professional communication. You can see a colleague's behavior as personal rejection, or as the result of their own stress and priorities. The discipline of assent teaches you that you have far more control over your experience than you might realize, not through changing external circumstances, but through consciously choosing which thoughts and interpretations you accept as valid and helpful. The Germanic campaigns tested every aspect of my character, but perhaps none more severely than my relationship with physical discomfort and hardship. As emperor, I could have remained in Rome, directing military operations from the comfort of marble halls, while others endured the harsh realities of frontier warfare. Instead, I chose to campaign with my troops, sharing the mud, cold, inadequate rations, and constant threat of attack that defined life on the northern borders. This decision wasn't motivated by false bravado or a desire to appear heroic to my soldiers. It emerged from a philosophical conviction that comfort and ease, while pleasant, actually weaken rather than strengthen human character. I had observed that people who consistently avoid physical challenges often struggle with psychological challenges as well. Conversely, those who embrace physical adversity develop mental resilience that serves them in every area of life. During my first winter campaign along the Danube, I experienced cold unlike anything I had known in Rome. My hands became so numb that I could barely hold a stylus to write orders. The leather tent that served as my headquarters provided minimal protection from wind that seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing. Food was scarce, sleep was intermittent, and every day brought the possibility of sudden attack from enemy forces. My initial response was to view these conditions as obstacles to overcome or endure until I could return to civilized comfort. But gradually, I began to see them as training opportunities, chances to practice the Stoic principle that external circumstances cannot harm us unless we allow them to disturb our inner tranquility. The cold was just cold until I decided it was unbearable. The hard ground was just a sleeping surface until I judged it inadequate for rest. I developed what I called voluntary discomfort practice, deliberately choosing harder options when easier ones were available. When traveling, I would sleep on the ground rather than in comfortable beds when circumstances permitted. During meals, I would eat simple foods rather than elaborate cuisine prepared by imperial chefs. In daily routine, I would walk rather than ride when time allowed. This wasn't masochism or artificial deprivation. It was systematic training designed to reduce my dependency on external comfort for internal well-being. Just as military exercises prepare soldiers for actual combat, voluntary discomfort prepared me for involuntary hardships that were inevitable in leadership and life. The practice yielded unexpected benefits beyond increased physical resilience. When I stopped requiring optimal conditions to maintain my equilibrium, I became more adaptable and less anxious about potential disruptions to my routine. When I learned to be content with simple pleasures, elaborate luxuries became enjoyable extras rather than psychological necessities. Perhaps, most importantly, embracing physical adversity taught me the difference between genuine needs and manufactured wants. I discovered that I could maintain health, effectiveness, and even happiness with far fewer material comforts than I had previously considered essential. This realization liberated me from the anxiety that comes from protecting and maintaining complex lifestyle requirements. The Germanic winters also taught me about the relationship between physical and mental toughness. Soldiers who had trained extensively in difficult conditions maintained better morale and decision-making capability when faced with actual hardships. Those who had been sheltered from discomfort struggled not only with the physical demands but with the psychological challenge of operating effectively under adverse conditions. I observed that physical adversity reveals character rather than creating it. The harsh conditions didn't change who my generals and advisors were, they exposed who they had always been. Some discovered inner strength they didn't know they possessed. Others revealed limitations that had been hidden by comfortable circumstances. The adversity was like a stress test that showed which materials were truly strong and which only appeared strong under ideal conditions. This understanding influenced how I evaluated people for important positions. Previous experience with hardship became a crucial qualification, not because suffering itself was valuable, but because it demonstrated the kind of character that would remain stable under pressure. Leaders who had never been tested by genuine adversity often failed when faced with their first serious challenges. The practice of embracing rather than avoiding physical challenges also provided a framework for handling other types of adversity: financial setbacks, relationship difficulties, professional failures. These became opportunities to practice the same mental approach I had developed toward physical discomfort. Instead of automatically viewing hardships as problems to escape, I learned to examine what they might teach me about resilience, adaptation, and character development. In your modern context, this principle applies whether you're facing literal, physical challenges or the metaphorical discomforts of professional and personal growth. The presentation that makes you nervous, the difficult conversation you've been avoiding, the project that stretches your capabilities beyond your comfort zone, these represent opportunities to build the same kind of character strength that physical adversity develops. The key is learning to embrace challenge rather than merely endure it, to see difficulty as training rather than punishment, and to recognize that your capacity for handling adversity expands through practice rather than through avoidance. When you stop requiring ideal conditions to perform effectively, you become virtually unbeatable, because you can operate excellently regardless of circumstances. As I write these words, I am acutely aware that my time as emperor and my time on earth grows shorter with each passing day. The campaigns along the northern frontier have taken their toll on my health, and I feel the weight of years settling into my bones like winter cold. This awareness of approaching mortality has brought unexpected clarity about what truly matters. In leadership and life, for much of my reign, I concerned myself with how history would judge my accomplishments. Would future generations remember me as a wise philosopher emperor, or as a ruler who failed to solve the empire's fundamental challenges? Would my military campaigns be seen as necessary defensive actions or costly mistakes? Would my legal reforms endure, or would subsequent emperors dismantle everything I had built? These questions consumed countless hours of mental energy until I realized they represented a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of legacy and the purpose of virtuous action. I was treating my reputation as if it were within my control, when in fact it depends entirely on the judgments of people I will never meet, based on information I cannot influence, filtered through perspectives I cannot predict. The breakthrough came during a quiet evening in my frontier tent, as I reviewed letters from Rome about succession planning. My adopted son Commodus would inherit the purple, and I found myself desperately hoping he would continue the philosophical approach to leadership that had guided my own reign. But I realized that my desire to control his choices and ensure my legacy's continuation was just another form of attachment to outcomes beyond my influence. That night, I let go of trying to control my posthumous reputation and focused instead on what remained entirely within my power, living each remaining day with virtue and integrity, regardless of how those choices might be remembered or continued by others. This shift from legacy-focused to virtue-focused thinking liberated me from anxiety about the future and allowed me to concentrate fully on present responsibilities. I began approaching each decision by asking not, how will this affect my reputation, but what response demonstrates virtue in this moment? Instead of crafting policies to impress future historians, I focused on serving current citizens according to justice and wisdom, rather than trying to build monuments that would preserve my name. I concentrated on modeling the principles I hoped others might adopt voluntarily. This approach paradoxically increased both my effectiveness as emperor and my peace of mind. When you're not constantly worried about protecting your reputation, you can take necessary risks and make unpopular decisions that serve the greater good. When you're not trying to control how others will judge your choices, you can focus entirely on making the best choices possible with available information. The question of succession crystallized this philosophical shift. I could not guarantee that Commodus would govern wisely, but I could ensure that he inherited institutions, advisors, and examples that would support good governance if he chose to embrace them. I could not control his character, but I could model the character I hoped he would develop. One could not determine his legacy, but I could complete my own with integrity. This process taught me that true legacy lies not in what people remember about you, but in the positive influence your actions have on the world, whether or not that influence is attributed to you. The legal reforms that improve citizens' lives, the military strategies that protect future generations, the philosophical insights that guide better decision-making, these contributions matter regardless of whether anyone remembers their source. I found profound peace in the recognition that the most important aspects of any legacy are invisible and immeasurable. The senator who learned patience from observing my responses to criticism, the general who adopted more thoughtful, strategic thinking after our conversations, the citizen who approached personal challenges with greater resilience after hearing about Stoic principles. These influences ripple outward in ways that can never be tracked or credited. Perhaps most importantly, I realized that mortality gives meaning to virtue rather than diminishing it. Because our time is limited, our choices about how to use that time become significant. Because we cannot take our accomplishments with us, we must find satisfaction in the quality of our efforts rather than the permanence of our achievements. Because everything external is temporary, we must locate our sense of purpose in character development and service to others. In your modern professional context, this same perspective transforms how you approach career building and personal fulfillment. Instead of working primarily for recognition, advancement, or lasting achievement, you can focus on contributing value and developing virtue through your daily choices. Instead of measuring success by external milestones, you can evaluate your progress by internal standards of character and service. The executive who asks, "How can I serve excellence today?" rather than "How will this advance my career?" often achieves both better results and greater satisfaction. The professional who focuses on developing integrity, wisdom, and compassion through their work creates a legacy that extends far beyond job titles or financial accumulation. When you accept that your time is limited and your control over outcomes is partial, you discover the freedom to invest your energy in what actually matters, being the kind of person you respect, contributing to causes larger than yourself, and modeling the character you hope to see in others. If I were to return today as a modern leader, perhaps as the CEO of a global corporation, a senior government official, or the head of a major organization, I would face challenges remarkably similar to those I encountered as Roman emperor. Despite the vast differences in technology, culture, and scale, the fundamental pressures of leadership, the weight of responsibility for others' welfare, and the psychological demands of making decisions under uncertainty remain constant across centuries. Consider the modern executive dealing with a corporate crisis that threatens thousands of jobs. The specific circumstances differ from managing plague outbreaks or barbarian invasions, but the essential challenge remains the same. How do you maintain inner tranquility and clear judgment while bearing responsibility for outcomes that affect many lives and depend partly on factors beyond your control? The Stoic principles I developed would apply directly to this situation. The discipline of desire would help the modern leader focus on excellent decision-making processes rather than guaranteeing specific outcomes. The discipline of action would provide a framework for making difficult choices based on virtue justice to stakeholders, courage in facing hard truths, wisdom in strategic thinking, and self-discipline in emotional responses rather than on political expediency or personal advancement. The inner citadel would prove equally valuable for today's professionals facing constant connectivity, social media scrutiny, and 24/7 news cycles. In my era, Criticism traveled slowly and came primarily from senators and educated citizens. Today's leaders face instantaneous, global commentary from millions of people with access to platforms that amplify every opinion. The need for psychological fortification against external judgment has multiplied exponentially. I would establish the same morning practice that sustained me through imperial crises, rising early to prepare mentally for the day's challenges, practicing negative visualization to reduce surprise and emotional volatility, and recommitting to principles that would guide decision-making regardless of external pressures. The specific format might involve digital detox periods, meditation apps, or structured reflection time, but the core purpose would remain unchanged. The plague years taught me about leading through uncontrollable crises, a lesson that applies directly to modern challenges like economic downturns, technological disruptions, or global pandemics. The key insight focusing exclusively on your sphere of influence. While accepting everything outside, it becomes even more crucial in today's interconnected world, where local events can have global consequences and individual leaders often face problems that require coordinated responses from multiple institutions. Dealing with difficult people in my court translates seamlessly to managing challenging colleagues, competitors, or stakeholders in contemporary organizations. The fundamental approach remains the same. Understand that others' behavior reflects their character and circumstances, not your worth. Expect people to behave consistently with their demonstrated patterns rather than your preferences, and respond strategically rather than emotionally to provocations and conflicts. The discipline of assent becomes particularly vital in today's information-saturated environment. Ancient emperors dealt with limited, slow-moving information from trusted sources. Modern leaders must process massive amounts of data, much of it contradictory, from sources of varying reliability. While making decisions under intense time pressure, the ability to distinguish between facts and interpretations, to question automatic assumptions, and to choose which thoughts deserve attention becomes essential for psychological survival and decision-making effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of service that transformed my understanding of leadership applies directly to modern organizational challenges. Whether leading a corporation, government agency, or non-profit organization, the shift from what can I achieve to how can I serve clarifies priorities and inspires others in ways that purely achievement-oriented leadership cannot match. The technological tools available today would enhance rather than replace the core practices I developed. Digital systems could track daily philosophical reflection, provide reminders about Stoic principles during stressful moments, and facilitate the kind of strategic thinking that separates emotional reactions from reasoned responses. But the technology itself is neutral. Its value depends entirely on the character and philosophical preparation of the person using it. I would face new challenges unknown in my era: the speed of modern communication, the complexity of global supply chains, the environmental consequences of industrial activity, and the social implications of technological advancement. But I would approach these modern challenges with the same fundamental strategy: develop unshakable inner strength, focus on virtue-based decision-making, accept uncertainty while taking decisive action, and maintain service to the common good. As the ultimate measure of success, the title emperor has disappeared, but the essential challenge of leadership, inspiring others to work toward common goals while maintaining your own psychological equilibrium under pressure, remains unchanged. The external circumstances of leadership evolve, but the internal requirements for effective leadership are timeless. Today's professionals who master these principles gain the same advantages I discovered: immunity to external validation, clarity in decision-making, resilience under pressure, and the deep satisfaction that comes from aligning daily actions with fundamental values. The person who cannot be broken by circumstances, who responds to challenges with wisdom rather than reactivity, and who serves something larger than personal advancement, becomes invaluable in any era. As my words near their end, I want to leave you with the most practical and immediate guidance for building the unbreakable mind that will serve you through whatever challenges life presents. The principles I've shared are not abstract philosophical concepts. They are daily practices that, when applied consistently, create a fortress of inner strength that no external circumstance can penetrate. Begin each day with the morning practice I have described. Spend time in quiet reflection before engaging with external demands. Visualize potential challenges and rehearse virtue-based responses. Remind yourself of life's impermanence to maintain perspective on what truly matters. And ask yourself how you want to embody your deepest values throughout the day ahead. Implement the pause practice immediately. Between any trigger and your response, insert a moment of conscious choice. Ask yourself, what response serves virtue? What response will I be proud of tomorrow? What response moves me toward the person I want to become? This single practice, applied consistently, will transform your relationships, your professional effectiveness, and your inner peace. Develop your inner citadel through daily boundary-setting exercises. Practice distinguishing between your preferences and your needs, between what you can control and what you cannot, between external events and your interpretations of those events. Strengthen your psychological defenses by refusing to allow others' opinions, circumstances beyond your influence, or temporary setbacks to determine your emotional state or self-worth. Apply the 3 disciplines systematically. The discipline of desire, want what happens rather than demanding that what you want happens. The discipline of action, make decisions based on virtue rather than outcomes, taking decisive action while remaining detached from results. The discipline of assent, examine your automatic thoughts and interpretations, choosing which mental content to accept and which to reject. When facing difficult people, remember that their behavior reveals their character, not your worth. Respond strategically rather than emotionally. Expect consistency from people based on their demonstrated patterns rather than your hopes. And use challenging interactions as opportunities to practice patience, clear communication, and principled responses. Accept that loss, setbacks, and disappointments are inevitable parts of human experience. Develop the skill of constructive, grief-feeling emotions fully while maintaining your capacity for effective action, honoring what was lost while remaining open to what remains, processing pain without allowing it to become a permanent identity. Embrace physical and psychological challenges as opportunities to build resilience rather than obstacles to endure. Voluntary discomfort, practice deliberately choosing harder options when easier ones are available, strengthens your independence from external conditions for internal well-being. Remember that true leadership, whether of others or simply of your own life, is fundamentally about service rather than achievement. Ask, how can I contribute, rather than what can I gain? And you will discover that both effectiveness and fulfillment increase dramatically. Most importantly, understand that building an unbreakable mind is not a destination, but a practice. Like physical fitness, philosophical strength requires consistent daily effort. There will be days when you react emotionally instead of responding wisely, when you allow external circumstances to disturb your peace, when you forget the principles that normally guide your decisions. This is normal and expected. The goal is not perfection, but improvement, becoming slightly more resilient, slightly wiser, slightly more virtuous with each passing day. The gradual transformation that results from this consistent practice is profound. Over time, You will notice that situations that once triggered intense anxiety now feel manageable. Criticism that once wounded your self-esteem now provides useful information without emotional turbulence. Setbacks that once seemed catastrophic now appear as temporary challenges requiring strategic response. You will discover that external circumstances have lost their power to control your internal state. Success and failure, praise and criticism, comfort and difficulty all become weather patterns that you observe and respond to appropriately without being emotionally controlled by them. This is not indifference, it is the deep peace that comes from knowing that your essential self remains intact regardless of what happens around you. The invitation I extend to you is the same one I accepted when I first encountered Stoic philosophy. Join the ranks of those who cannot be broken, not because they avoid challenges or hide from difficulties, but because they have built inner strength that transforms obstacles into opportunities, setbacks into learning experiences, and temporary defeats into stepping stones toward wisdom. The world needs leaders who cannot be corrupted by success or destroyed by failure, professionals who respond to pressure with composure, and individuals who model virtue regardless of circumstances. The world needs people who are unbreakable, not because they are hard, but because they are flexible, not because they feel nothing, but because they choose their responses, not because they control everything, but because they master themselves. Your journey toward becoming unbreakable begins with the next choice you make. Choose wisely, and let that choice be the first stone in your own inner citadel.